We are now here with Jeff Goodwin. He is a professor of sociology at NYU and a leading scholar on social movements. His latest piece in Catalyst, which I will be talking to him about today, is Black Reconstruction as Class War. Jeff, good to see you.
Thanks for having me.
So let's just dive right into your Catalyst piece. It is, of course, on the great W.E.B. Du Bois. And I just want to start by sort of mentioning that, as you point out in the piece, I think a lot of people, and even people on the left, will often downplay or even sometimes outright dismiss W.E.B. Du Bois's Marxism, right? And that's kind of the central focus of your piece. And I want to dive into the specifics of Reconstruction, of Black Reconstruction in a minute. But first, I want to ask you, why do you think it's so important to understand and kind of foreground Du Bois as a Marxist and not just simply as an anti-racist or an intersectionalist? And then maybe, adding on to that, how did he become a Marxist?
Right. Well, the truth is important. And, I'm often frustrated when I read accounts of Du Bois, which somehow managed to overlook the fact that he became a Marxist. And you really can't understand, I think, his work after the mid-1930s without appreciating the fact that he did become a Marxist during the Depression, and later became a kind of fellow traveler of the Communist Party as well. So these affiliations and theoretical commitments are important for understanding the man and his writings, beginning with Black Reconstruction. The story of how he became a Marxist is quite interesting. He had been interested in socialism for many years, and there's some essays in a 1920 book called Dark Water, which were very positive towards socialism and basically envisioned a socialist future. He was also captivated by the Russian Revolution, and in 1926 he had an opportunity to travel to the Soviet Union, and by all accounts, that trip had a huge effect on Du Bois. He was quite impressed by what was going on in the Soviet Union. This was just some months before Stalin came to power, it should be said. Mm-hmm. And it was around that time, I think, that Du Bois kind of decided to learn more about Marxism. And although that didn't really happen until the early 1930s. And I think one of the motivations for Du Bois to study Marxism for the first time in the early 1930s. Well, there are a number of things going on. Obviously, the Depression, so the biggest crisis of capitalism ever, was going on. And but more than that, there was a challenge within Du Bois's own organization, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, an organization which he helped found and whose journal, called The Crisis, he had edited for going back to 1910. And but within that organization, there arose a group of people called the Young Turks, who were basically Marxist in orientation, certainly sympathetic to Marxism. They were critical of the NAACP for lacking an economic program. And more than that, they were all more or less committed to this idea that racism in the United States, racial oppression in the United States, really couldn't be challenged forcefully except by a strong interracial labor movement. Mm-hmm. and they really wanted to push the NAACP in this direction. And so I think Du Bois was challenged by that, and so he began reading. He asked some of these people, especially economists by the name of Abram Harris, to help him learn about Marxism, to recommend some things he might read. And so at the age of 65, Du Bois is not a young man at this point any longer. At the age of 65, he begins reading Marx, Engels, Lenin quite carefully. And the result is that this book he's working on at the time, in which he finishes up a few years later, Black Reconstruction in America, it's really his first Marxist book, his first Marxist analysis, and strongly reflects his discovery of Marxist ideas and concepts. Especially class analysis and the importance of class struggle in history.
Yeah, so let's turn now to Black Reconstruction. Obviously, that is sort of the focus of your piece for Catalyst. You point out that Du Bois writes that he considered Reconstruction, quote, a dictatorship of labor. He also writes that he considers Reconstruction an extraordinary experiment of Marxism that preceded the Soviet Union. So that seems like a pretty clear indication that he's sort of operating from a Marxist framework here. But maybe talk a little bit about why he viewed Reconstruction in those terms. And then following that, how does race figure into all of this? Because obviously the title of the book is Black Reconstruction, not Marxist Reconstruction or working class Reconstruction. So yeah, talk a little bit about that.
Right, sure. One thing I should say by way of preface is that Black Reconstruction is, as I argue, is really a study of revolution and counter-revolution in the United States. It does provide a history and a kind of state-by-state analysis of the Reconstruction governments of the South, but that's set within this broader framework of revolution, of a workers' revolution by the slave workers of the South, as he calls them. That's what really brings about these labor governments in the South. That's really what he's referring to when he calls Reconstruction an extraordinary Marxist experiment. It's coming to the power of these Republican governments, state governments, which he views as labor governments. A bit problematically, we can talk more about that. And then the book concludes by talking about the counter-revolution against these labor governments, or dictatorships of labor, as he calls them, which, of course, stripped African Americans of their civil and political rights and eventually ushered in the Jim Crow era. So it's important it's almost never said, but I really do think it's important to understand that this is a study of revolution and counter-revolution. Now, he was actually about to call the Republican governments, these labor governments in the South, dictatorships of the proletariat, using the Marxist concept. But some of the Marxists that he was in contact with, in dialogue with, in the run-up to completing the book, and who had read the manuscript, told him, no, that's really not right. That's not, those governments were really not dictatorships of the proletariat, led by organized working classes, demanding, common ownership of the, means of production. And Du Bois accepted this, above all, I think, because, it's true that the workers who made this revolution, the slave workers, as well as poor whites, were actually not demanding common ownership of the means of production. They were demanding individual ownership of land, and they wanted the main demand of the emancipated enslaved workers was for the plantations to be broken up and the land distributed to individual families, right?
Mm-hmm.
That never happened, actually. That was the signal failure of Reconstruction, and Du Bois suggested that failure led straight away to the what he calls the counterrevolution of property, which
Mm-hmm.
overthrew Reconstruction. But he did call these state governments led by Republicans, backed by working class and poor blacks and whites in some states. He did call them dictatorships of labor, not dictatorships of the proletariat, but he did see them basically as labor governments. And I mentioned that's a little bit problematic because most of the politicians who indeed represented primarily working class base, they themselves were not a working class people.
Mm-hmm.
They tended to be petty bourgeois, farmers, in some cases, merchants, artisans, and so forth. And they really did not, as Du Bois points out, they really did not have much of an economic program themselves, and they did not, by and large, support the redistribution of land to the formerly enslaved. And so it's a bit of a stretch to call these Republican governments dictatorships of labor or to see them as labor governments. They were, led by petty bourgeois politicians who kind of indifferently represented the interests of their base, of their working class base.
Mm-hmm. So I now want to turn to this question of race, which I had brought up before, and maybe the way to get into that is, we should say that one of the most famous lines, if not the most famous line from Black Reconstruction, is probably the one that concerns white workers' racism, right, and the so-called quote, psychological wage that they earn. Now, as you point out in the piece, that concept of the so-called wages of whiteness has kind of taken on a life of its own. So maybe talk a little bit about, first, what did Du Bois actually think about white workers' commitment to this idea of racial superiority, and how did that influence the Reconstruction period?
Sure. Of course, the main thing that I would want to stress is that for Du Bois, racism, wasn't just one thing, but it was rooted in the material interests of different classes, and accordingly, it took on different forms for different classes. And certainly, the the racism that mattered most during this period was the racism of the elites, right?
Yes.
The racism of the planter class in particular. And both the old slave-owning aristocracy, but also the planter elite that survived the Civil War. And Du Bois argues that their racism was basically a legitimating ideology. He doesn't use that phrase, but he basically saw it as their way of legitimizing their rule and exploitation of enslaved people. So it had an economic material foundation. The main motive of slavery, of course, was to take advantage of a cheap labor force, to exploit it and to get wealthy. And Du Bois said that these exploiters, this ruling class, found, invented, and proved racism as a way of, again, legitimizing its exploitation. And that was also the case after the Civil War, during the Jim Crow era, during the era of sharecropping and so forth, debt peonage, the racism, the dominant racism was really economically motivated. Now, Of course, there was, however, as you say, racism among white workers, and Du Bois interpreted this as a response to the fears of white workers that slaves, or more specifically, newly emancipated slaves, would compete for them for jobs, and that those individuals would be willing to work for less, and that they would be replaced by these former enslaved people. And so it was really competition in the labor market, an idea that, again, which Du Bois kind of took from Abram Harris, who I mentioned earlier. He wrote a book called The Black Worker, which had a big influence on Du Bois. And so the idea was that working class racism, above all, was rooted in this fear of unemployment, this fear that Black workers would be willing to work for less, and they would be used to take their jobs and so forth. So it's a different kind of racism with a different kind of motivation than that of the ruling class.
As I mentioned, what's interesting about this line about the white worker's psychological wage is that it kind of took on a life of its own, right? It became like sort of like its own field, like whiteness studies, right? The wages of whiteness. What do you think popular conceptions of that line get wrong, and help us set the record straight?
Yeah. Well, Du Bois talks about this psychological wage. He doesn't actually use the concept of whiteness. It's kind of implicit. But you have to realize we're talking about a few paragraphs that stretch across a couple pages of a 700-page book. This is not a central idea in the book. And it's not a very well-developed idea. And in my own opinion, it's not a very good idea. But basically, the idea is that white workers, in addition to their material wage, in addition to the pay they received, which was not very much at all, but in addition to that, they received, unlike African American workers, an additional psychological wage. Well, what was this? Well, if you read Du Bois, he's basically saying, whites had rights, civil and political rights. And that was what they had, which Black workers did not. He's clearly referring here to the post-Reconstruction era, when African Americans have been, again, stripped of civil and political rights. And but whites retained those rights. They also had some status, at least among other whites. But it's a little strange calling this a psychological wage, because these were real things, right? They weren't just in the minds of the white workers. Presumably, what Du Bois wants to say is that having these rights and this status, which Black workers lacked, had a psychological effect on workers. It made them feel superior. Now the question, though, is, how did white workers respond to that? In these passages where Du Bois talks very briefly and not very coherently about this psychological wage, the implication is that these workers will do almost anything to hang on to their superior status, and prevent Blacks from gaining rights and status. It's almost as if they have this psychological need for someone to be beneath them in the social order, right? You have to keep someone below you. You can't allow, the white workers just couldn't allow the Black workers to attain equality with them. But again, Du Bois doesn't really explain this very well. It's not a very strong argument to me, and also has kind of, really invidious consequences, this argument. Because if it's true of white workers, it's presumably true of black workers. That is to say, black workers too would try to keep someone, if they could, some other group beneath them, right? So it's just not a very strong argument, and it doesn't really explain why the white workers wouldn't come to try to unite, right, with black workers, to forge a united front against their common oppressor. And there were efforts to do that, of course, in the 19th century, and of course into the 20th, and up to the present day. So it's been obviously there's been a very mixed record of interracial solidarity in this country. Racial divisions then and now continue to be a very serious problem. I don't think Du Bois really explained this very well. He had his ideas about what motivated white racism, but he also clearly understood the possibility of interracial solidarity. And another argument he marshals, in fact, is that the ruling class always does everything it can to divide workers among themselves, right? To keep up animosity between black and white workers, precisely out of fear that they will, unify. And so there's that element as well. But I just don't think that Du Bois he didn't really set out to understand how interracial solidarity might be possible, when and where it was attempted, the sort of things which made it more difficult here in specific times and places. But he clearly did believe at the end of the day that, we need interracial solidarity. He spent much of his last years arguing for, the importance of interracial solidarity. He was sometimes very pessimistic about the possibility of it, but he certainly understood in principle how it's absolutely necessary, not only, to bring about the socialism that he was committed to, but it was also necessary to destroy the racial oppression that was, his main preoccupation for really his entire life.
I think something that's kind of related is, something that you point out in your piece is taking Du Bois's Marxism seriously, of course, means also addressing some of its shortcomings, right? So, where do you see his vision of socialism sort of going astray, with regard, not just with regard to Reconstruction, but also, of course, with regard to the Soviet Union?
Yes, well, he kept his distance from the Communist Party for a great many years. I think this goes back to disagreements and infighting between the Communist Party and the NAACP back in the 20s and 30s. But after the Second World War, he really became very close to the Communist Party. As I said earlier, he became something of a so-called fellow traveler, and he eventually, just a couple years before his death, actually applied for membership in the Communist Party, a very dwindling, weak Communist Party at that point. This is following the Khrushchev revelations and the Soviet invasion of Hungary and so forth, which Du Bois defended. He also wrote an excruciatingly painful obituary to Stalin, which makes for difficult reading. He thought Stalin, to be a great man, and so forth. So he really became a committed Stalinist in his final decades. And it's difficult, of course, to understand entirely the reasons behind this. But I do think it has something to do with his long-standing kind of reverence for leadership, for strong leadership, and the need for strong leadership, politically speaking. And he was famous for an idea that the African American community really needed a talented 10th to lead it kind of out of the political wilderness that is, the 10th of the Black population, the educated, smart people, experienced people could lead the way. He didn't have a great deal of faith in kind of ordinary, for a socialist in particular, he didn't have a great deal of faith in the capacity of ordinary people to kind of run their own affairs. He really thought especially those who were not well educated and lacked kind of worldly experience, they really needed this educated elite to show them the way. And so I think that that kind of attracted him to a kind of vanguardist politics and to a kind of top-down version of socialism. It also led him actually to say in the book Black Reconstruction that, after the Civil War, it probably would have been ideal, he suggested, if the suffrage were limited to, if there was some kind of education qualification to vote. So he was not actually, he had some doubts about the wisdom of universal suffrage for African Americans, well, for all Americans, whose wisdom he doubted, and whose capacity for self-governance he doubted. So I think this has a lot to do with, of course, the talented 10th. By the talented 10th, he meant people like himself.
Right.
People like himself, smart, accomplished people to lead their race to, to victory, to great achievements, etc. And I think that kind of elitism really, really infected his view of socialism and led him to this kind of Stalinist politics.
Right. All right. Well, maybe just to wrap up, obviously, despite some of those shortcomings and the later life Stalinism, you obviously feel that Black Reconstruction is a very important text. It's very important and crucial to kind of understand it through this Marxist lens, as we've been talking about. And so I want to go back to maybe something that's sort of similar to the first question I asked you, which is, Black Reconstruction at this point is almost like 100 years old, right? And so maybe the question to wrap up on is in a way, it's does any of this matter? Does it matter that some people see Black Reconstruction as an intersectional text rather than a Marxist text? The final question for you, I suppose, is how does understanding Black Reconstruction through this Marxist lens that you're arguing for, how does this lead us to better, sort of more concrete politics today?
Yeah, well, it's a very good question. I mean, I think the book in some ways is very contemporary with its concern for, not just describing, but understanding racial oppression, what's the foundation of racial oppression, and also what's the foundation of racism among working class people, white working class people in particular. And these are questions that Du Bois takes up in the book. And for that reason alone, it's worth reading and hearing him out. But I think his Marxist or political economic take on these questions is what is very interesting and something you don't see all that much these days. He's really kind of questioning the whole approach to racism and racial oppression that starts from prejudice, right? Which starts from discrimination, which starts from culture and ideas. And he really wants to dig beneath those. He's convinced, Marx, his reading of Marx has convinced him that, racism is when it becomes attached to, linked to the material interests of classes, particularly powerful classes, then it can become, a very powerful force indeed. So he wants to demonstrate that connection between material interests, especially the material interests of capitalists, of the owning class, and how that can lead to racist practices, racial oppression, racial inequalities. And so I think that sort of political economy approach to, or Marxist approach to racism is what's most interesting about the book, and which makes it worth reading. And I think that's what drew Du Bois to Marxism in the first place, I think. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of, if you say these days that, someone became a Marxist because they wanted to better understand racial oppression, a lot of people will just kind of, have a quizzical look on their face because, they've been told, well, Marxism, isn't that all about class and economics? It doesn't really say anything about racism. Well, on the contrary, one of the things I want to point out in this piece I wrote is that there's a very rich Marxist tradition of trying to understand and theorize racial oppression.
Right.
Du Bois is a leading figure in it, but it also includes people like C.L.R. James, people like Oliver Cromwell Cox, Eric Williams, Walter Rodney, Manning Marable, the list goes on and on. Stuart Hall, and it's hard to think of a theoretical tradition which has produced such really rich analyses of racism, other than Marxism. So far from being shocked that someone might turn to Marxism to understand racism, that shouldn't surprise us at all. The surprise is that so many people have this view of Marxism that it's somehow all about class, and that race and gender and nationality and nationalism and other types of oppression have somehow not been addressed by Marxists, which of course is the opposite of the truth. So anyhow, I hope people will not only take a look at Du Bois, but some of these other authors in the Marxist tradition who are trying to understand racial oppression on the basis of class analysis.
All right. Again, Jeff Goodwin's latest piece for Catalyst is Black Reconstruction as Class War. We will link that below. I highly recommend it. And of course, co-sign all of the other authors Jeff just mentioned. Jeff, thank you so much for your time. It was great to see you.
Thanks very much.
If you like this video from The Jacobin Show, please hit like and subscribe and share with your friends. Thanks.